Hey guys, before we dive in, drop a comment with the exact time and place you're watching this. Are you in bed at midnight, on a train at sunrise? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our deep dives into history you didn't know existed. Tonight, we're stepping into a world far darker than the movies ever show you. A world where the sea doesn't sparkle, treasure isn't gold, and life is cheap. This is the real, horrible life of pirates. Close your eyes and imagine the ocean. Not the calm, postcard perfect kind, but gray, restless, and merciless. The wind slashes at your face. Salt stings your eyes. Every day is a battle, and every night could be your last. Hunger gnaws at your stomach. Disease creeps through your body. And death is always close. Forget charming rogues, fancy hats, and shiny swords. Most pirates never saw another sunrise. And if they did, they were often missing fingers, teeth, or worse. Life aboard a pirate ship was relentless, filthy, and terrifying. So, take a deep breath, tighten your grip, and prepare to witness the truth behind the Jolly Roger. This is not a story for the faint of heart. This is the horrible life of pirates.
The daily grind, life aboard a pirate ship. The sun had barely crested the horizon, casting a weak, pale glow over the restless sea. Jonas woke to the cold bite of salt air whipping across the deck, his body stiff and sore from sleeping on a damp hammock slung between the ship's beams. The groan of timbers and the slap of waves against the hull were his morning alarm. There was no comfort, no gentle awakening. The ship itself demanded attention, and the moment a man stirred, the day of endless labor began. "Move, you lazy dog!" a gruff voice barked from the quarterdeck. The captain's whip cracked sharply, echoing across the deck. Jonas's stomach sank as he rolled out of his hammock. Already he could see the older sailors hauling ropes, their muscles taut, knuckles white, backs glistening with sweat and sea spray. Life aboard a pirate ship was a machine of cruelty disguised as work. Every man had a role, and failing in it was dangerous. The deck had to be scrubbed, sails repaired, cannon loaded and maintained, ropes coiled and stowed properly. There was no rest until the task was done, and even then the threat of punishment hung like a cloud over every sailor. Jonas stumbled to the ropes, hands raw from yesterday's labor. The splinters in the wooden deck dug into his bare feet, and the salt stung the blisters on his hands. Sweat and sea spray mixed, running down his back as he heaved the heavy ropes over his shoulder. The rhythm was brutal. Pull, strain, grunt, repeat. It never ended.
Above him, the lookout shouted, "Land, starboard!" A wave of hope swept the deck for a moment, quickly replaced by tension. Land could mean supplies or enemy forces. Pirates rarely reached shore without risking a firefight, imprisonment, or ambush. The sea was merciless, but humans could be even crueler. Food on the ship was another daily torment. Each man was allotted hardtack, a biscuit so dry it could crack teeth if bitten without first soaking it in water. Salted meat, preserved for months, had a smell that clung to clothes and hair, and worms often wriggled through it unnoticed until it was too late. Fresh water was rationed to a small barrel shared among the crew, and the weak often went thirsty. Scurvy was already creeping through the ranks, leaving men with bleeding gums, loose teeth, and blackened tongues. Jonas had seen an older sailor gnawing on a piece of leather, mistaking it for food in desperation. Illness spread like wildfire in the cramped, poorly ventilated ship. Dysentery, typhus, and fever claimed more lives than the battles themselves. Sailors coughed and vomited in the corners, their bodies twisting in agony. Some fell overboard quietly in the night, their absence only noticed the next morning when the crew counted heads. The infirmary was a tiny, dark corner of the ship, with little more than a few rags and a barrel of rum to dull the pain.
Yet, even as the crew suffered, the social hierarchy on the ship was rigid and unforgiving. The captain ruled with an iron fist, and lieutenants enforced his orders without question. One mistake could earn a man the lash, a stint in chains, or a gruesome punishment like the keel haul, dragging a man under the ship along the barnacle-encrusted hull, leaving deep cuts or death by drowning. The fear of punishment kept every sailor on edge, constantly calculating every move. Jonas had learned to watch the older men, studying how they moved, how they carried themselves, and how they avoided the captain's ire. Even small gestures, a hesitant glance, a misstep, or a poorly coiled rope could be fatal. Survival required more than strength. It demanded cunning, obedience, and nerves of steel. The ship itself was a cruel teacher. Decks that tilted with every wave made balance nearly impossible, and the rigging threatened death with every misstep. Storms were merciless. Gales could rip sails to shreds, toss men overboard, or smash the ship against hidden rocks. Each wave brought a reminder. The sea did not forgive mistakes. The mental strain was constant. Sleep was fleeting. Nightmares common. Jonas would often wake in the dead of night, listening to the creak of the ship, the whispers of men in the shadows, and the wind slicing through the rigging. Some sailors went mad under the pressure, muttering to themselves, rocking back and forth, or even attacking imaginary foes. The thin line between survival and insanity was something Jonas now understood all too well.
And yet, amidst this misery, there was a grim camaraderie. Men shared what little food they had, warned each other of danger, and occasionally laughed to stave off despair. They were a family forged in fear, suffering, and survival. Every shared burden, every rope pulled together, every cannon fired side by side cemented their bond. Jonas tightened his grip on the rope, muscles burning, lungs heaving. Another day, he thought, another day alive. But he knew that surviving was not enough. To endure, he would need to become stronger, smarter, and colder than he had ever imagined. Because aboard a pirate ship, mercy was rare, and the sea was never forgiving. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed higher, burning weakly through the damp fog. Jonas's muscles screamed with fatigue, yet the work never ceased. The ship's sails needed constant attention, patched from previous storms and frayed edges threatening to tear completely in the next gust. He climbed the rigging, the woods slick with salt, every step a gamble. A single misstep could send him tumbling dozens of feet onto the unforgiving deck below.
Above him, a seagull screeched, diving and circling the ship. For a brief moment, Jonas envied the bird's freedom. It had no captain, no punishments, no scarcity of food. But then a gust of wind nearly threw him from the rigging, and he clung desperately, heart pounding, palms raw. Survival was not about freedom. It was about holding on, hour by hour, day by day. Below deck, the situation was no better.
The crew's living quarters were cramped, dark, and filthy. Rats scuttled over every surface, gnawing at scraps of food, and even at human flesh if given the chance. The stench of unwashed bodies, sweat, and rotting meat was constant. Sailors slept wherever they could, some sharing hammocks, others lying on the wooden planks with nothing but thin blankets. Privacy was non-existent. Intimacy was a luxury they could not afford. Jonas had started waking before dawn each day to sneak to the small galley. If he was lucky, he could grab a dry piece of hardtack and a cup of water before the others awoke. Meals were a frantic scramble. Whoever was slow or unlucky could be left with nothing but scraps. Hunger was relentless, gnawing at his stomach, weakening him more than any battle wound ever could. The older sailors often shared stories during these brief moments, warning Jonas of what to expect. "Never let the captain see hesitation in your eyes," one muttered, a scar running down his cheek. "A flicker of doubt, and he'll make sure you regret it," another added. "Watch the others. Some will smile at you today and try to kill you tomorrow. Trust no one but yourself." Jonas nodded silently, absorbing every word. Paranoia was a survival tool. As the day wore on, small conflicts erupted. A sailor accused another of hoarding a few measly pieces of salted meat. Shouts turned into punches, and the fight spilled across the deck. Jonas watched, heart in his throat, as the captain appeared. The two combatants froze, realizing their mistake. One of them would get whipped, the other sent below deck with a bruise and a lesson. Violence was not just a consequence of battle, it was part of daily life. Even minor errors could escalate. A poorly coiled rope, a misfired cannon, or a dropped barrel might mean hours of punishment or more. Jonas had learned to check every knot, inspect every sail, and anticipate every order. Mistakes were deadly, and luck alone would not keep him alive. By afternoon, the sun climbed high enough to bake the deck. Jonas's skin burned, salt crusted in his hair, and every movement made his muscles ache. Sweat ran into his eyes, stinging, blurring his vision. And yet there was no break. The work was relentless, and the captain expected perfection. When storms came, the labor intensified. Jonas remembered the last gale vividly. Waves had towered over the deck, crashing down with the force of falling buildings. Ropes snapped under the strain, sails shredded in seconds, and the screams of men filled the air. Jonas had been thrown against the railing, nearly swept overboard, and only survived by gripping a rope with every ounce of strength. The storm lasted for hours, leaving the crew drenched, exhausted, and terrified. The next day, they worked as if nothing had happened. There was no pause for trauma, only survival. The nights offered no respite. Sleep was short, broken by the rocking of the ship, the cold, and the sound of men vomiting overboard. Rats squeaked, gnawed, and crept over sleeping bodies. Jonas often lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling of the hold, imagining every possible danger: enemy ships, storms, disease, and betrayal from within the crew. Fear became a constant companion, whispering in his ear and ensuring he never let his guard down. Even moments of rest were tainted. Occasionally, the crew caught sight of a passing ship, a whale, or a distant island. For a brief second, hope flared. Maybe food, fresh water, or land. But those hopes rarely lasted. The sea was vast, unyielding, and cruel. And if the crew ever made landfall, it was often at the mercy of hostile settlements or the Navy.
pirates were not welcome anywhere. Jonas began keeping a mental list of survival strategies: how to climb the rigging without slipping, how to handle a rope under pressure, how to avoid the captain's wrath, and, most importantly, how to endure hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Every day was a lesson in patience, observation, and cunning. Despite it all, there were small moments of humanity. Laughter sometimes bubbled up during a hard day, usually at some minor mistake or shared hardship. Crew members shared water or the last bite of meat. Occasionally, someone would hum a tune, and Jonas would hum along, clinging to the fleeting warmth of normalcy in a world gone mad.
But such moments were rare. Mostly the ship was a world of pain, fear, and survival. Jonas knew that to endure, he could not rely on luck, camaraderie, or hope alone. He had to become stronger, faster, smarter, and more ruthless than anyone else on the deck. And even then, survival was never guaranteed. As dusk fell, the crew's labors finally slowed. The deck was soaked with sweat and seawater, sails repaired, or shredded beyond repair, and the ropes coiled for another day. Jonas collapsed onto a bench, muscles trembling, and stared at the horizon. The sun dipped below the waves, painting the sea a fiery orange. For a moment, it was almost beautiful, almost peaceful, almost a reminder that life existed beyond the constant torment. But Jonas knew better. The sun would rise again, and with it, the endless grind of pirate life, brutal, unforgiving, and merciless. He tightened his grip on the worn rope beside him. Another day survived, yes, but at what cost? Weeks passed like a relentless tide, each day blending into the next, and Jonas's body grew accustomed to the ceaseless labor, though his mind did not. Every sunrise brought the same stench, the same hunger, the same fear. There was no variety, only repetition, punctuated by occasional bursts of chaos.
One morning, as Jonas scrubbed the deck with brine and a rough brush, he overheard a heated argument between two sailors. One accused the other of stealing a piece of hardtack, a crime that could earn a whipping or worse. The captain's lieutenant, a gaunt man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, appeared in the shadows. With a flick of his hand, both men froze. One of them would pay for the accusation with pain. The other might survive, but their relationship would forever carry tension. Jonas realized that trust among the crew was a luxury few could afford. Jonas also began noticing the older men's strategies for survival. "Don't draw attention," muttered an old sailor named Barrett. "Keep your hands moving, eyes down, and never question orders. The captain watches everything." Barrett's advice was simple but deadly true. Every glance, every hesitation, every mistake could spell doom. Meals continued to be a daily test. One afternoon, Jonas discovered a rat had chewed through his portion of salted meat. Frustration mixed with hunger, but complaining was dangerous. The older sailors shrugged, suggesting he either share his luck with the next ration or go without. Jonas learned quickly that complaining did not change reality. It only drew unwanted attention. The ship's routine included more than work. There were inspections, cleaning drills, and constant maintenance. Sails had to be patched, ropes coiled, and cannons oiled to prevent rust.
Jonas and a small team were often assigned to climb the rigging to check for damage high above the deck. The slightest misstep meant a fall of dozens of feet. The men laughed nervously at each other's mistakes, not out of humor, but as a way to release tension that could otherwise consume them.
During one evening, a small scuffle erupted over water rations. 2 sailors had grabbed more than their fair share, and the resulting fight sent barrels of water crashing across the deck. Jonas watched as the captain appeared, whip in hand, and the 2 men were punished in front of the crew. Pain, humiliation, and fear reminded everyone of the strict hierarchy. Survival demanded obedience, and defiance was often fatal. As days turned to weeks, Jonas began noticing subtle signs of mental strain among the crew. Some sailors muttered to themselves in the dark, rocking in place as if the motion could keep their thoughts from spiraling. Others stared blankly at the horizon for hours, lost in the monotony of the endless sea. Madness was never far away. The constant pressure of hunger, exhaustion, and fear pushed men to the brink. But there were moments of solidarity too. When a small storm threatened to rip the sails apart, the crew worked together, hauling ropes and reinforcing the rigging. The shared effort created a temporary camaraderie, a reminder that survival often depended on unity. Jonas learned to navigate these fleeting alliances carefully. One sailor, Thomas, shared a story one night in the hold, his voice low and trembling. He had once been a merchant's son, taken by pirates against his will. He spoke of his family, his home, and the life he had lost. Jonas listened, feeling both sympathy and fear. He knew that attachments could be dangerous. Grief could slow a man down, distract him, or make him vulnerable. The sea demanded focus, or it would take everything from you.
Sleep remained elusive. Nights were punctuated by the sounds of groaning sailors, crashing waves, and the occasional distant scream. Rats scuttled across hammocks, and the stench of human waste mixed with salt and rot. Jonas had begun to dream in fragments. Dark waters, missing limbs, and shadowy figures chasing him across the deck. He woke each time drenched in sweat, muscles tense and heart racing. Even with the fear and misery, the sea offered brief glimpses of beauty. One morning, the sky burned with pink and orange as the sun rose over a calm horizon. The waves sparkled like broken glass, and for a moment the crew paused their work, mesmerized by the rare spectacle. Jonas allowed himself to marvel, knowing such moments were fleeting. Soon enough, the relentless grind would resume, demanding every ounce of his strength. The weeks continued in this cycle of work, hunger, exhaustion, and fleeting reprieve. Each day Jonas grew stronger, faster, and more attentive. He learned to anticipate storms, to read the crew's moods, and to avoid the captain's wrath. He observed every detail, how ropes were tied, how cannons were loaded, how to climb the rigging without slipping. Each skill was a lifeline, each mistake potentially fatal.
Jonas's awareness grew not just of the ship, but of the human condition at sea. He saw desperation etched into faces, heard the silent prayers of men hoping to survive another day, and recognized the thin line separating sanity from madness. The ship was not just a vessel, it was a crucible, testing every sailor's body, mind, and spirit. And Jonas, despite his youth and inexperience, was learning to endure. The daily grind, raids, accidents, and superstition. Weeks at sea blended into a gray monotony, but the first hint of a distant ship always sent a jolt of adrenaline through the crew. Jonas had begun to recognize the tension in their movements, the sudden glances toward the horizon, hushed whispers among the sailors, and the subtle tightening of muscles as men prepared for action. Pirates rarely waited to confirm their prey. Opportunity and instinct dictated the attack, and hesitation could be deadly. One afternoon, the lookout shouted, "Sloop approaching starboard bow!" Chaos erupted instantly. Jonas dropped the coil of rope he had been organizing and sprinted to his station by the cannons. The deck turned into a frenzy of shouted orders, clanging metal, and hurried footsteps. Sailors scrambled to load the cannons, unfurl the sails, and secure themselves for the battle ahead. The smell of gunpowder and salt filled the air, mingling with fear.
Jonas watched as a cannon misfired, flames licking the wood and smoke stinging his eyes. A man screamed as a burning rope caught his sleeve. The captain roared from above, whipping the nearest sailor mercilessly. One mistake could destroy the ship or get you killed. Jonas's hands shook as he hauled another cannonball, silently praying he would not fumble. When the pirates boarded the merchant ship, Jonas was thrust into the chaos of close combat. Swords clashed, boards creaked under the weight of men, and screams pierced the air. Jonas saw men cut and bruised, some thrown overboard, others crushed beneath barrels. The adrenaline was intoxicating, yet terrifying. Every movement required focus, or death came fast. The raid ended with the crew dragging what spoils they could back to their ship. Gold coins, weapons, food, and barrels of water were divided according to the captain's strict rules. The spoils never seemed enough to sustain morale, and arguments often erupted over fairness. Jonas had learned early to stay quiet and claim the scraps he could, observing the hierarchy with a careful eye. Accidents were almost as dangerous as battle. One evening, Jonas climbed the rigging to repair a torn sail. A misjudged step sent him slipping, only saved from a fatal fall by a rope looped around his waist. His knuckles were scraped raw, and the fall left him trembling, but he knew any complaint would be met with ridicule or punishment. Accidents were a reminder that the ship demanded constant vigilance, that the line between survival and death was razor thin.
Superstitions thrived aboard the ship as sailors clung to rituals to appease the sea and the spirits. Whistling on deck was forbidden lest it summon storms. A black cat aboard a ship was considered a lucky omen, unless it crossed your path at night, which meant misfortune or death. Sailors whispered prayers to gods long forgotten, leaving offerings of rum and coins in the hopes that luck would favor them. Jonas joined in reluctantly, knowing it was often less about faith and more about survival through caution and ritual. One night, the ship's cook, an old man named Seamus, told Jonas about the legend of the ghost ship of the drowned. Sailors said it appeared during the darkest storms, manned by the spirits of those who had died at sea, seeking to drag the living into the depths. Jonas listened, shivering, as Seamus described how sailors who ignored these stories were often the first to fall during a storm or raid. Fear, superstition, and experience blended into survival strategy. Every legend carried a lesson. Even minor injuries could be fatal if ignored. Jonas saw a sailor cut deeply while handling a rope, his wound ignored until infection set in. Days later, the man lay feverish, delirious, too weak to stand. The infirmary could only do so much, and the crew continued to work around him as if he were already gone. The sea demanded productivity over compassion. Despite all this, Jonas was growing sharper, more agile, and more alert.
He began noticing the subtle cues of battle, how a merchant ship might react to a cannon volley, the way ropes moved with the wind, or how an enemy's crew shifted in panic. Knowledge became a weapon. Observing others, understanding danger, and controlling fear were the only tools a young sailor had to survive.
The days and nights blurred together, a relentless cycle of work, danger, and small triumphs. Each raid, each storm, and each accident carved experience into Jonas's muscles, mind, and spirit. The pirate life was nothing like the glamorous tales he had once imagined. There was no honor in victory, no satisfaction in wealth, and no comfort in survival. The sea demanded more than strength. It demanded cunning, ruthlessness, and a willingness to endure horrors most men could not imagine. Yet amidst the chaos, Jonas began to feel a grim understanding of the rules of this world. Fear was constant, but control of oneself could make the difference between life and death. Observation and cunning could save you where strength alone could not. And even in the harshest conditions, small victories, like repairing a sail before the next storm, or surviving an attack unscathed, provided fleeting sparks of hope, proof that endurance was possible. By the time night fell, Jonas's body ached, his hands were torn, and his stomach growled relentlessly. The deck was slick with sweat, salt, and grime, yet he survived. He survived another day in the hellish rhythm of pirate life, learning that the smallest lessons, how to tie a knot, how to stay calm, how to read the wind, were as vital as any sword in battle. The sun would rise again, bringing another day of toil, danger, and hunger. Jonas tightened his grip on the rope beside him, knowing that to survive he must continue to adapt, to endure, and to outthink the sea, the ship, and every man aboard. The daily grind, raids, injuries, and crew backstories. Several weeks into the voyage, the crew spotted a small coastal sloop hugging the horizon. The sight electrified the deck. Pirates thrived on the chase, and every opportunity for plunder was a test of skill, nerve, and luck. Jonas could feel his pulse quicken. The men readied the cannons, checked cutlasses, and hauled heavy ropes with practiced efficiency, each action part of a deadly dance. The first cannon fire shattered the quiet morning. Splinters flew, screams pierced the air, and smoke burned eyes and lungs. Jonas dove for cover, hauling another cannonball into position. A sailor beside him was hit by a splinter and fell, blood seeping through his clothes. The captain barked orders, whipping the survivors into obedience. Survival meant speed, precision, and nerves of steel. Jonas noticed the subtle differences between men who would live and those who wouldn't. The strongest weren't always the quickest. They were the alert, the cunning, the ones who anticipated danger. A misstep could be fatal, and the line between life and death was razor thin. After the sloop surrendered, the crew plundered what they could. Barrels of salted meat, a few coins, and a stash of rum. Arguments erupted over the division. Jonas watched in silence. Experience had taught him that speaking out of turn could draw the captain's ire. Some men received nearly nothing. Others were punished for arguing. Jonas quietly stashed what he could, grateful for the scraps. Not every raid ended in success. One stormy afternoon, the crew attempted to board a larger merchant ship, but heavy waves overturned small rowboats, throwing men into the icy water. Jonas nearly went overboard himself, saved only by the rope he clutched desperately. 2 sailors drowned before help could reach them. The captain's reaction was cold indifference. Losses at sea were expected, and grief was considered a weakness. Accidents were frequent, almost routine. A falling spar crushed one man's leg. Another slipped while climbing the rigging, twisting his ankle and sending him tumbling across the deck. The infirmary could do little, leaving the injured weak and vulnerable. Yet even in pain, survival required participation in daily duties. Those who could not perform were at risk of punishment or abandonment. Jonas began to observe the lives of the older sailors more closely. Barrett, the scarred veteran, had lost an eye in a raid but remained one of the most efficient men on deck. Seamus, the cook, had a limp from a fall but still managed to feed the crew. Every scar told a story, every injury a lesson. Pain was permanent, but cunning and adaptation could preserve life. During quiet moments, the men shared stories of their pasts. Thomas, the merchant's son, revealed how he had been kidnapped from his family. Another sailor, a former soldier named Merrick, spoke of battles lost to the crown, of comrades falling to muskets and disease. These stories were not idle chatter. They were survival lessons. Jonas realized that understanding others' mistakes and misfortunes could prevent his own death. Superstitions ran deep. A sudden chill or an oddly shaped cloud could spark whispers of doom. A black cat sighting or the unexpected flight of a gull prompted rituals or offerings of rum. Jonas participated reluctantly, recognizing the practicality of caution dressed as superstition. Fear was manageable when it was structured, ritualized. Chaos was far deadlier. Life at sea had its brief, surreal moments of beauty. One evening, after a minor skirmish, the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson. The waves sparkled like shattered glass, and the exhausted crew paused, marveling at the rare calm. Jonas allowed himself a fleeting smile, knowing it was only temporary. The sea's mercy was short-lived, and another storm or raid was always near. Weeks blurred together. Work, raids, injury, fear, and fleeting hope. Jonas learned to anticipate storms, read enemy ships, and observe the crew's moods. Survival required cunning, observation, and cold calculation. Mistakes were punished severely. Hesitation could kill. But each day also offered lessons: how to tie ropes faster, load cannons more efficiently, and handle fear.
By the time night fell, Jonas lay on the deck, body exhausted, hands raw, and stomach empty. Rats scuttled past, and the smell of salt, sweat, and decay filled the air. He stared at the stars above, trying to find solace in their distant light. Survival meant endurance, and endurance demanded sacrifice. Every scar, bruise, and nightmare was a testament to life at sea. Jonas tightened his grip on the rope beside him. He had survived another day, learned another lesson, and observed the subtle rules of this world. The sea would rise again with another sun, demanding strength, cunning, and unyielding vigilance. Only the clever, the alert, and the ruthless would endure, and even then, survival was never guaranteed. The daily grind, raids, injuries, and crew backstories. Several weeks into the voyage, the crew spotted a small coastal sloop hugging the horizon. The sight electrified the deck. Pirates thrive on the chase, and every opportunity for plunder was a test of skill, nerve, and luck. Jonas could feel his pulse quicken. The men readied the cannons, checked cutlasses, and hauled heavy ropes with practiced efficiency, each action part of a deadly dance.
The first cannon fire shattered the quiet morning. Splinters flew, screams pierced the air, and smoke burned eyes and lungs. Jonas dove for cover, hauling another cannonball into position. A sailor beside him was hit by a splinter and fell, blood seeping through his clothes. The captain barked orders, whipping the survivors into obedience. Survival meant speed, precision, and nerves of steel. Jonas noticed the subtle differences between men who would live and those who wouldn't. The strongest weren't always the quickest. They were the alert, the cunning, the ones who anticipated danger. A misstep could be fatal, and the line between life and death was razor thin. After the sloop surrendered, the crew plundered what they could: barrels of salted meat, a few coins, and a stash of rum. Arguments erupted over the division. Jonas watched in silence. Experience had taught him that speaking out of turn could draw the captain's ire. Some men received nearly nothing, others were punished for arguing. Jonas quietly stashed what he could, grateful for the scraps. Not every raid ended in success. One stormy afternoon, the crew attempted to board a larger merchant ship, but heavy waves overturned small rowboats, throwing men into the icy water. Jonas nearly went overboard himself, saved only by the rope he clutched desperately. 2 sailors drowned before help could reach them. The captain's reaction was cold indifference. Losses at sea were expected, and grief was considered a weakness. Accidents were frequent, almost routine. A falling spar crushed one man's leg. Another slipped while climbing the rigging, twisting his ankle and sending him tumbling across the deck. The infirmary could do little, leaving the injured weak and vulnerable. Yet even in pain, survival required participation in daily duties. Those who could not perform were at risk of punishment or abandonment. Jonas began to observe the lives of the older sailors more closely. Barrett, the scarred veteran, had lost an eye in a raid, but remained one of the most efficient men on deck. Seamus, the cook, had a limp from a fall, but still managed to feed the crew. Every scar told a story, every injury a lesson. Pain was permanent, but cunning and adaptation could preserve life. During quiet moments, the men shared stories of their pasts. Thomas, the merchant's son, revealed how he had been kidnapped from his family. Another sailor, a former soldier named Merrick, spoke of battles lost to the crown, of comrades falling to muskets and disease. These stories were not idle chatter. They were survival lessons. Jonas realized that understanding others' mistakes and misfortunes could prevent his own death.
Life at sea had its brief, surreal moments of beauty. One evening, after a minor skirmish, the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson. The waves sparkled like shattered glass, and the exhausted crew paused, marveling at the rare calm. Jonas allowed himself a fleeting smile, knowing it was only temporary. The sea's mercy was short-lived, and another storm or raid was always near. Weeks blurred together. Work, raids, injury, fear, and fleeting hope. Jonas learned to anticipate storms, read enemy ships, and observe the crew's moods. Survival required cunning, observation, and cold calculation. Mistakes were punished severely. Hesitation could kill. But each day also offered lessons: how to tie ropes faster, load cannons more efficiently, and handle fear. By the time night fell, Jonas lay on the deck, body exhausted, hands raw and stomach empty. Rats scuttled past, and the smell of salt, sweat, and decay filled the air. He stared at the stars above, trying to find solace in their distant light. Survival meant endurance, and endurance demanded sacrifice. Every scar, bruise, and nightmare was a testament to life at sea. Jonas tightened his grip on the rope beside him. He had survived another day, learned another lesson, and observed the subtle rules of this world. The sea would rise again with another sun, demanding strength, cunning, and unyielding vigilance. Only the clever, the alert, and the ruthless would endure, and even then, survival was never guaranteed.
The daily grind, the raid that went wrong. It was a gray morning, the kind where the sea and sky blended into a flat, merciless expanse. Jonas had barely stirred when the lookout shouted, "Three-masted ship, approaching fast!" The crew sprang into action, a mixture of adrenaline and dread tightening their chests. The ship was a wealthy merchant vessel, heavily laden with goods and gold. The captain barked orders with a ferocity that made men flinch. Cannons were loaded, sails adjusted, and ropes lashed into position. Jonas felt the familiar thrill of fear, a knife-edge awareness that sharpened his senses and made his muscles tense. As the pirates closed in, the first volley of cannon fire tore through the merchant ship's rigging. Splinters flew, and smoke stung Jonas's eyes. One of the crew screamed as a rope snapped, whipping across the deck like a snake. A sailor near Jonas stumbled and fell overboard, his screams swallowed by the waves before anyone could reach him.
The raid turned disastrous. A sudden squall struck, waves crashing over the deck, tossing men like rag dolls. 2 sailors were swept overboard, and one fell against a mast, breaking his leg. Another slipped on the wet deck, striking his head with a sickening thud. Jonas scrambled to help, but the captain's furious bellow reminded everyone that hesitation could be punished as harshly as cowardice. Amid the chaos, the crew realized the merchant ship was sturdier than expected. It had hidden compartments of armed guards who poured musket fire onto the pirates. Several men fell, blood mixing with seawater and rain. Jonas watched as Barrett, the scarred veteran, took a musket shot to the shoulder, but continued fighting, gritting his teeth and holding his sword. Survival required endurance, even when injured beyond reason. By the end of the battle, the pirates had suffered severe losses. 5 men were dead, and many more were injured, bleeding, or delirious. The merchant ship, though damaged, escaped in the storm, leaving the pirates battered, exhausted, and empty-handed. Jonas shivered in the cold rain, muscles trembling and stomach empty. The reality of life at sea hit harder than any cannonball. The sea did not reward bravery, only endurance and cunning. Back on their ship, the crew worked to tend to injuries. The infirmary was overcrowded, with men moaning in pain and delirium. Jonas assisted where he could, learning how to bind wounds, administer rudimentary care, and keep the dying conscious just long enough to avoid panic among the rest. Disease, infection, and exposure would claim more lives than the failed raid itself.
That night, Jonas lay on the deck, soaked and shivering. The stench of blood, salt, and fear clung to him. Rats scuttled past, indifferent to the horrors above. The stars were obscured by clouds, leaving only darkness to press down upon him. He reflected on the day, the chaos, the screams, the near-death moments, and the futility of it all. Survival was not about glory or wealth. It was about enduring pain, fear, and relentless adversity. The raid had left scars, both visible and invisible. Jonas noticed the hollow-eyed stares of men who had seen their friends die. Some muttered to themselves, recounting what went wrong. Others drank excessively,
trying to drown the memory of screams and blood. The mental strain was nearly as lethal as the physical injuries. Jonas tightened his grip on a rope, staring at the dark, endless horizon. He realized that life as a pirate was a constant gamble. Even skill, courage, and cunning could not guarantee survival. Only adaptation, vigilance, and a hardened mind could give a man a chance to see another sunrise. The next day, the ship creaked and groaned under its repairs. Sails were patched, ropes coiled, and injured men slowly returned to duties, or at least attempted to. Jonas moved with a newfound understanding. The sea, the ship, and the crew were a crucible. Endurance was the only currency, and survival the only measure of success.
In the quiet moments between storms and work, Jonas began to internalize the harsh lessons of pirate life. Fear is constant, trust is fragile, and death is ever present. Every sunrise brought opportunity in peril, and every sunset brought reflection, pain, and exhaustion. The raid had been a harsh teacher. Jonas's body ached, his hands were raw, and his stomach was empty, yet he had survived. That survival, he realized, was not luck. It was attention, cunning, and sheer will. The sea demanded more than strength. It demanded knowledge, discipline, and a mind that never faltered. The daily grind, aftermath of the failed raid. The morning after the disastrous raid, the deck of the pirate ship was a scene of grim labor. Blood had dried into the wooden planks, and the smell of salt, sweat, and fear lingered in every corner. Jonas moved among the injured, assisting where he could, though he knew that many would not survive. Survival at sea was cruel, and the infirmary offered little beyond rudimentary bandages, rum, and the faint hope of luck. Barrett, the veteran with a missing eye, sat slumped against the mast, his shoulder still bleeding from the musket shot. Jonas helped bind the wound as best he could, but infection was inevitable. "Luck favors the prepared, Jonas," Barrett muttered, grimacing in pain. "But sometimes, even preparation isn't enough." His words hung in the damp air, a reminder of the thin line between life and death aboard a pirate ship.
2 men had succumbed overnight, their bodies slumped in corners of the hold. One, a young sailor named Philip, had been swept overboard during the raid, pulled under by the merciless waves. The other, a cook's apprentice, had fallen ill from an infected cut, the fever consuming him by dawn. Their absence was noted quietly, almost mechanically, as the crew continued their daily tasks. Death was routine, and grief was a luxury none could afford. Jonas noticed the subtle changes in the crew's behavior. Some men muttered constantly to themselves, rocking back and forth in the dim light of the hold. Others avoided each other, silent and withdrawn, haunted by the memory of friends lost and blood spilled. Madness was creeping through the crew, one man at a time, and Jonas realized that fear could kill just as efficiently as cannon fire. Rations had to be divided more carefully now. With fewer men and limited supplies, hunger gnawed more sharply at those remaining. The cook, Seamus, worked tirelessly to stretch every scrap, boiling what little meat remained into a thin, nearly inedible stew. Men fought over portions, whispers of theft and hoarding spreading like wildfire. Jonas had learned long ago to keep his head down, taking only what he needed, and observing the fragile dynamics of the crew. The captain's rage was constant,
yet controlled. He did not mourn the dead nor offer comfort to the injured. Every mistake, hesitation, or complaint risked punishment. Jonas watched as one sailor, exhausted from tending to the wounded, was lashed for failing to secure a sail properly. Pain, humiliation, and fear reinforced the rigid hierarchy. Survival required more than skill. It demanded obedience and constant vigilance.
Night brought little relief. Jonas lay on the deck, muscles stiff, stomach hollow, ears ringing with the echoes of screams and cannon fire from the previous day. Rats scuttled over bodies, searching for scraps, indifferent to the human suffering around them. He stared at the sky, dark and clouded, feeling the weight of the endless sea pressing down on him. The stars offered no guidance, only distance and cold light. Superstitions gained strength in the aftermath. Men whispered about curses, angry spirits, and the ghost ship of the drowned, claiming the raid's failure and the subsequent deaths were signs of wrath from the sea itself. Jonas humored the stories silently. He knew survival depended on vigilance and cunning, but he allowed superstition to guide certain rituals, pouring a bit of rum over the side, muttering quiet prayers to calm the fears that gnawed at the crew's sanity. Over the following days, the injured were tended to as best they could. Some recovered slowly, their strength returning with time and care. Others succumbed to infections, fevers, or despair. The ship moved through the waters like a grim procession, each day a test of endurance and patience. Jonas observed carefully, noting how fear, exhaustion, and hunger shaped every action. Small moments of tension arose from seemingly minor incidents. A sailor accused another of taking an extra ration of hardtack, triggering a fist fight that ended with both men bruised and bloodied. The captain watched silently from above, allowing the men to learn the consequences of disobedience and infighting. Jonas had learned that in such an environment, observation and discretion were as vital as physical strength.
Amidst the suffering, brief glimpses of camaraderie emerged. Men shared water, whispered warnings about hidden dangers, or quietly helped a friend climb the rigging. These small acts of solidarity were essential for survival, offering fleeting hope in a world dominated by pain and fear. Jonas clung to these moments, knowing that endurance relied not only on strength, but on understanding and navigating human behavior. Weeks passed, and the psychological toll became undeniable. Some sailors refused to speak, lost in their own spirals of fear and despair. Others laughed at nothing, their minds fraying under the relentless pressure of starvation, injury, and near constant danger. Jonas realized that endurance required more than physical resilience. It demanded mental fortitude and the ability to detach from suffering without losing the will to survive. Jonas tightened his grip on the railing, staring out over the dark, churning sea. He thought of the friends he had lost, the injuries he had witnessed, and the daily grind that left no room for rest. Survival was a series of small, deliberate choices. How to tie a rope, how to avoid the captain's wrath, how to endure hunger and exhaustion. Every sunrise was a challenge, every night a test of will. The raid had left scars that would not heal. The crew had lost men, endured injuries, and witnessed horrors that would haunt them long after the ship reached the horizon.
Jonas understood now that pirate life was not about adventure or glory. It was about survival, adaptation, and the grim acceptance of a world where death lurked at every turn.
And so, as the sun rose again over the endless waves, Jonas prepared for another day. He adjusted the sails, checked the ropes, and braced himself for the relentless grind of life aboard the pirate ship. Survival demanded nothing less than constant vigilance, and Jonas was learning that the cost of weakness was far greater than he had ever imagined. The daily grind, minor raids, and rising tensions. The days blurred into a haze of labor, hunger, and fear. Jonas had lost count of how many weeks they had spent at sea, the relentless routine leaving him both physically and mentally exhausted. Even the minor raids, once thrilling, had become exercises in endurance rather than profit or glory. One morning, the lookout spotted a small fishing vessel struggling near a reef. The crew cheered quietly. This was an easy target, unlikely to resist. Jonas helped haul ropes and prepare the cannons, his muscles aching from the previous week's work. The attack began with a volley of cannon fire, sending splinters flying, and the frightened fishermen scrambling. Jonas's hands shook as he loaded cannonballs, sweat and salt crusting on his skin. The fishing crew surrendered quickly, but the pirates' work was not done. Barrels of salted fish and a few coins were dragged aboard, then divided according to the captain's orders.
Arguments erupted almost immediately. Some sailors claimed they had done the most work and deserved the lion's share. Others accused men of stealing extra rations during the chaos. The captain watched silently at first, letting the men vent their frustrations. But a harsh bark of his voice, followed by a few lashes for the loudest complainers, reminded everyone that authority was absolute. Jonas had learned to keep his head down. He took only his fair share and observed the subtle politics of the crew. Small gestures, a knowing glance, a whispered warning, a careful choice of words could make the difference between survival and punishment. The pirates had a hierarchy of fear, respect, and cunning, and Jonas was beginning to understand the rules. The minor raids continued over the following weeks. Each brought new challenges, storms that threw men overboard, barrels of food smashing to the deck, ropes snapping under tension, and injuries that could quickly become fatal if left untreated. Jonas witnessed a man lose a finger while handling a cannon, and another collapse from exhaustion after hauling a sail for hours on end. The infirmary overflowed with cuts, bruises, and fevers, leaving little room for compassion or care. As the crew endured this endless cycle, tension began to simmer. Some men whispered about the captain's cruelty, his harsh punishments, and the lack of reward after weeks at sea. Others grumbled about the unfair division of spoils or the relentless labor demanded of them. Jonas overheard hushed conversations in the hold, talk of desertion, rebellion, and revenge.
The seeds of mutiny were taking root. It was subtle at first, a glare that lingered too long, a sailor ignoring orders, a whispered complaint carried through the damp corridors. But Jonas noticed the pattern. Fear and fatigue were breeding resentment, and resentment was dangerous. Jonas also began to learn more about the personal stories of his fellow sailors. Thomas, the kidnapped merchant's son, had begun to speak more freely about his family,
his voice trembling as he recalled nights spent hiding from pirates before joining their ranks. Merrick, the former soldier, shared grim tales of lost battles and comrades left behind. These stories were not just entertainment, they were lessons in survival, showing Jonas how different men coped with fear, loss, and the relentless pressures of pirate life. Superstitions remained strong among the crew. Jonas watched men pour rum over the deck to appease the sea, whisper prayers to gods long forgotten, and avoid whistling or speaking certain words. Fear and ritual were intertwined, providing structure in a world where chaos and death were constants. Jonas joined in, not out of faith, but because it helped him navigate the fragile psychology of the men around him. The minor raids were not without consequence. Injuries accumulated, tempers flared, and the mental strain grew. Jonas began to notice subtle changes in himself, heightened awareness, constant tension, and a careful calculation of every action. He observed the men around him, noting who might be a threat, who might falter under pressure, and who could be trusted, if anyone.
One evening, after a particularly exhausting day hauling barrels of salted fish and repairing sails damaged by a storm, Jonas overheard two sailors plotting quietly in the hold. Their voices were low but tense, filled with resentment toward the captain and frustration with the endless toil. Jonas felt a chill run down his spine. Mutiny was not idle talk. It was a threat. And in the world of pirates, threats were often settled in blood. Jonas tightened his grip on a rope and exhaled slowly. He knew that surviving the sea required more than strength and skill. It required observation, patience, and the ability to navigate the fragile alliances and simmering tensions among the crew. Every day was a test of endurance, every night a trial of will. The minor raids continued, the injuries piled up, and the whisperings of rebellion grew louder. Jonas watched and learned, understanding that survival was as much about managing human behavior as it was about navigating storms or firing cannons. In this harsh, unforgiving world, the clever and the vigilant endured, while the weak, the rash, and the inattentive fell to the relentless grind of pirate life. The daily grind. Mutiny tensions escalate. The whisperings had grown louder. Jonas could feel the undercurrent of resentment among the crew, thickening like fog over the deck. Men who had once laughed together now avoided each other, their eyes darting nervously, hands twitching toward knives or ropes. The captain's harsh punishments and the relentless toil had pushed them to the edge. It began with subtle acts of defiance. A sailor deliberately slowed when hauling ropes. Another muttered curses under his breath when the captain was out of sight. Jonas noticed it all, cataloging each movement, each glance, each whispered conversation. Survival was no longer just about avoiding accidents or enemy fire. It was about navigating human psychology. One stormy night, the tension finally erupted. The captain demanded an extra haul of sails, despite the crew being soaked and exhausted. Some men hesitated, refusing to obey immediately. The captain, furious, whipped the nearest sailor, but instead of submitting, another man, fueled by exhaustion and anger, raised a hand against the officer. Shouts erupted, and soon half the hold was involved in a chaotic confrontation. Jonas moved cautiously, staying close to the shadows, observing who would falter and who would rise. He had learned that involvement could be deadly, but inaction could also be deadly. He weighed his options carefully,
noticing the captain's eyes scanning for the ringleaders of dissent. The fight was brutal and unrestrained. Blows were exchanged, sailors were thrown against barrels and ropes, and the smell of blood mixed with rain and salt. Jonas ducked and rolled to avoid a swinging fist, feeling the sting as his sleeve was torn. He realized that surviving mutiny required both awareness and action, knowing when to fight, when to retreat, and when to stay invisible. By dawn, the skirmish had ended. The captain had lashed several men, leaving bruises and welts as reminders of his authority. Some sailors had minor injuries. A few were badly hurt. Fear temporarily subdued the crew, but Jonas could see the smoldering resentment that would not die. The seeds of rebellion had been watered, and it was only a matter of time before they grew again. In the aftermath, Jonas began to notice how men coped differently with trauma and fear. Barrett, the veteran, kept silent, methodical, calculating every move. Merrick, the former soldier, raged quietly, his mind replaying the fight endlessly. Thomas, the kidnapped merchant's son, withdrew, haunted by the memories of failure and loss. Jonas realized that understanding these behaviors was crucial. In this environment, psychological insight could mean the difference between life and death.
Superstition and ritual played an even larger role now. Men whispered to the sea, poured rum over the deck, and avoided certain words or gestures, claiming they were necessary to appease the spirits of the drowned. Jonas humored these rituals, understanding that sometimes belief, even feigned, was essential to keeping panic and mutiny at bay. Jonas also began to take small but deliberate steps to protect himself. He learned to position himself near strong allies, to avoid confrontations that could escalate, and to maintain awareness of every sailor's mood and intentions. Observation had become a weapon. He realized that brute strength alone would not ensure survival. Cunning, adaptability, and patience were equally critical. By the end of the week, the crew had recovered enough to attempt another minor raid. Jonas noted the tension in every glance, every movement. Fear, anger, and exhaustion coexisted uneasily, threatening to erupt at the slightest provocation. Survival meant balancing caution with action, strength with observation, and endurance with strategy. Jonas tightened his grip on the rope beside him, muscles aching, stomach empty, and mind alert. The sea, the ship, and the crew demanded everything. One misstep, physical, psychological, or social, could mean death. And yet, he was learning. Each scrape, each bruise, each near miss honed his instincts. Survival was no longer just a hope, it was becoming a skill. The seeds of mutiny, though temporarily subdued, would grow again. Jonas understood that navigating life aboard a pirate ship required more than endurance. It required intelligence, cunning, and the ability to read both the sea and the men who sailed it.
And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonas braced himself for another night of vigilance, knowing that in the world of pirates, danger was eternal, and only those who could adapt would endure. The daily grind, the storm that tested all. The morning had been deceptively calm, with a gray sky that hinted at unease, but offered no warning of the fury to come. Jonas was on deck, hauling ropes and adjusting the sails, when a sudden gust snapped a line, nearly throwing him off balance. The older sailors exchanged worried glances. Barrett muttered, "Storm's comin', worse than anything we've faced." By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened, thick clouds blotting out the sun. The wind rose in furious gusts, tossing the ship like a toy on the waves. Rain pelted Jonas's face, soaking through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. Every deck movement became treacherous, ropes whipped with sudden force, and sails threatened to tear under the strain. The captain barked orders, his voice nearly lost in the roar of wind and sea. The crew scrambled, some slipping and falling, others clinging desperately to ropes or beams. Jonas's hands were raw from hauling lines, his muscles screaming with effort. The storm showed no mercy. Every mistake could result in broken limbs, drowning, or death.
Lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the deck in brief, blinding flashes. One sailor was thrown overboard as a wave smashed across the deck. Another was pinned beneath a mast that had broken loose. Jonas barely avoided being crushed himself, diving beneath the rigging and gripping a rope with white-knuckled determination. Fear surged through him, but he focused on each action, knowing hesitation would be fatal. The storm raged for hours, the ship groaning under the relentless force of wind and waves. Barrels and crates were tossed across the deck like toys. Water poured through the hatches, soaking supplies and threatening to sweep men into the sea. Jonas worked feverishly, assisting injured sailors while keeping the sails under control. Each second was a battle against both nature and circumstance.
When the storm finally subsided, the damage was horrifying. 2 men had drowned, swept away by massive waves. Several were injured, some critically. Broken limbs, deep lacerations, and concussions from flying debris. Supplies had been ruined. Food and water were scarce, forcing the crew to ration what little remained. The smell of salt, blood, and decay lingered in the air. Psychological strain was evident. Many sailors sat silently, shaking, haunted by the near-death experience. Others argued violently over ration distribution, their nerves frayed by fear and hunger. Jonas noticed how fear, exhaustion, and pain could turn even the most loyal men against each other. Observation and careful navigation of these dynamics were crucial to survival. Jonas's own skills were tested to their limits. He moved quickly and deliberately, helping the wounded, securing torn sails, and guiding terrified sailors. Each decision required calculation. Which rope to grab first? Which sailor needed immediate attention? Which corner of the deck offered safety from flying debris? He realized that survival was no longer dependent solely on strength. It required cunning, adaptability, and a mind attuned to chaos. Amidst the destruction, small acts of solidarity persisted. Barrett and Jonas helped lift a fallen sailor. Merrick tended to a cut with trembling hands, and Seamus distributed small sips of water to the dehydrated. These moments reminded Jonas that even in the cruelest conditions, survival depended not only on individual skill, but also on careful cooperation and mutual support. That night, as the ship drifted in the aftermath of the storm, Jonas lay on the deck, drenched, exhausted, and starving. His mind replayed the events over and over. The screams, the flying debris, the wave that had claimed a man beside him. Sleep was fitful, filled with nightmares of drowning, snapping ropes, and crushing masts. The storm had left physical and mental scars, reminding him that life aboard a pirate ship was a constant negotiation with death. By sunrise, the crew had begun the grim work of repair. Sails were patched, ropes re-secured, and supplies inventoried. Injuries were tended to as best they could, and rationing became stricter than ever.
Jonas moved among the men, noting who was fit for work and who teetered on the edge of collapse. Survival demanded vigilance, not just in battle, but in understanding the limitations of both body and mind. Jonas's awareness had grown sharper. He noticed subtle signs of fatigue, fear, and disobedience among the crew. He understood that surviving a pirate life required reading people as carefully as he read the weather. The storm had been a cruel teacher, but it had strengthened his resolve, sharpened his instincts, and reinforced a single, unyielding truth. The sea did not forgive mistakes, and the weak perished. The daily grind, recovery, and rising responsibility. The storm had passed, but its scars remained. The deck was splintered, sails patched with scraps, and ropes frayed from the violent winds. Jonas moved carefully among the injured and exhausted crew, helping where he could, while keeping an eye on the captain's strict expectations. Every man was tested, physically, mentally, and socially.
Illness began to spread among those weakened by the storm. Fever and infection claimed a few, their groans echoing through the hold. One man's leg wound, untreated properly in the chaos, had become gangrenous. Jonas helped clean and bandage what he could, but medicine was rudimentary, and the fear of infection lingered over every sailor. Survival meant vigilance, not just against the sea, but against disease and injury. Rations were tighter than ever. The storm had ruined barrels of salted meat and most of the fresh water supply. Arguments flared over the remaining food, and the captain enforced harsh punishments for those accused of taking more than their share. Jonas learned to anticipate disputes, taking only what he needed and positioning himself near stronger allies. Observation and subtle strategy had become as vital as physical strength. With so many injured, Jonas was called upon to help coordinate repairs and oversee minor tasks among the crew. He guided men in securing sails, patching holes, and moving heavy supplies. The captain, recognizing his diligence and awareness, began to trust him with small responsibilities. It was dangerous. Any mistake could bring punishment, but it also gave Jonas a measure of influence and survival advantage. The psychological toll of the storm was undeniable. Some sailors were silent, eyes distant, haunted by near-death experiences. Others became irritable or violent, taking out their frustration on anyone nearby. Jonas noted the patterns carefully: who was likely to lash out, who might falter in battle, and who could be counted on to follow orders despite exhaustion. His ability to read people had become a survival skill.
Even amidst exhaustion, superstitions and rituals persisted. Men whispered prayers to the sea, poured rum over the deck, and avoided actions considered unlucky. Jonas observed quietly, understanding that these behaviors, though irrational, helped maintain a fragile sense of order. Fear could be weaponized or mitigated with careful attention to belief. Weeks after the storm, minor raids resumed. Jonas continued to assist in planning and execution, applying lessons learned from past failures. His ability to anticipate enemy movements, assess crew readiness, and handle small emergencies increased his value. He was no longer just a young, inexperienced sailor. He was becoming an essential part of the ship's survival machinery. The crew's morale remained fragile. Tension simmered under the surface, occasionally flaring in arguments, whispered threats, or subtle acts of defiance. Jonas witnessed these interactions carefully, noting alliances, rivalries, and the first whispers of mutiny. Survival required not only skill, but also careful navigation of human behavior and emotion. In the hold, Jonas discovered small ways to maintain some control over his own fate. He learned how to ration his energy, how to position himself near safety, and how to help others in ways that earned their respect without drawing the captain's wrath. Each choice was deliberate, each action calculated. In this world, cunning often mattered more than brute strength. By the end of the week, Jonas was exhausted, but growing in confidence. He had survived injuries, storms, and conflict, observing and learning from each challenge. He began to understand the unspoken rules of pirate life. Fear was constant, trust was rare, and survival demanded intelligence, patience, and the ability to read both the sea and the men around him. As night fell over the quieted ship, Jonas looked out at the dark horizon. The sea was calm for now, but he knew it would not remain so. Life aboard a pirate ship was relentless, demanding constant vigilance and adaptability. And Jonas, despite his youth, had begun to learn not just how to survive, but how to endure, adapt, and thrive in a world where weakness meant death. The daily grind, rising conflicts, and Jonas's leadership. The weeks following the storm brought a tense equilibrium aboard the ship. Men moved with caution, wary of both the unpredictable sea and each other. Minor raids continued, but the crew's fatigue and lingering fear fueled arguments and rivalries. Small slights escalated into fights. Whispered complaints turned into open confrontations. The fragile social order aboard the pirate ship was cracking.
Jonas noticed it first in subtle ways. Two sailors argued over the division of rations, shoving and cursing, only restrained by the proximity of stronger men. Another sailor accused a comrade of sabotaging a sail repair, prompting threats and near blows. The captain, preoccupied with the next raid and the remaining ship repairs, dealt only sporadically with the disputes. Authority was maintained more by fear than fairness, and Jonas saw the tensions simmering just beneath the surface. Jonas had begun to assume more responsibility. The captain, recognizing his reliability and keen awareness, allowed him to oversee small groups during routine tasks. He directed sailors in repairing torn sails, securing cargo, and managing minor disputes. The trust was subtle but significant. He was now a mediator, a guide, and an observer with influence, all while still navigating the dangers of both sea and crew. One evening, a confrontation escalated beyond control. Two men, fueled by exhaustion, hunger, and resentment, drew knives over a dispute about stolen food. The crew froze, unsure how to react. Jonas acted instinctively. He stepped between them, using calm but firm words to de-escalate the situation. His knowledge of each man's temperament allowed him to predict their movements, prevent injury, and maintain order without the captain's direct intervention.
This event did not go unnoticed. Several men began to look at Jonas differently, some with respect, others with jealousy. He realized that leadership required more than strength. It required perception, psychological insight, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. In a crew where survival often depended on cunning as much as muscle, these qualities were rare and valuable. Rivalries continued to flare. Thomas, the kidnapped merchant's son, became a target for jealousy due to his skill with navigation and careful observation. Merrick, the former soldier, chafed under Jonas's growing influence, occasionally muttering insults or undermining his instructions. Jonas had learned to navigate these subtle conflicts, intervening when necessary, diffusing tension and aligning allies carefully. Survival now meant understanding power dynamics and human behavior as acutely as understanding storms or sails. Superstition and ritual remained constant undercurrents. Men whispered about curses and angry spirits, claiming that disputes and failures were signs of the sea's displeasure. Jonas observed quietly, participating when necessary, understanding that rituals often soothed fear and maintained fragile cohesion. Fear, when managed, could be a tool. When uncontrolled, it became lethal. Jonas also began to take more personal risks. During a minor raid, he suggested a strategy to approach a merchant vessel that avoided exposure to hidden guns. The plan succeeded, netting the crew barrels of supplies and a few coins. The captain nodded approvingly, recognizing the young sailor's growing competence. Jonas realized that action, coupled with careful calculation, could enhance survival and influence even in a crew dominated by fear and brutality.
By the end of the week, the ship had settled into a tense but functional rhythm. Minor injuries were patched, supplies distributed sparingly, and the crew adjusted to their precarious balance of fear, respect, and survival instinct. Jonas had emerged as a quietly influential figure, a mediator, strategist, and observer. His survival had always depended on caution, skill, and observation. Now it also depended on leadership, the ability to influence others, and the delicate management of tension aboard a ship where mutiny and disaster were constant threats. As night fell, Jonas stood at the railing, gazing at the dark horizon. The sea was calm for now, but he knew that storms, both literal and human, were inevitable. Survival required more than endurance. It demanded awareness, cunning, and the ability to act decisively when danger loomed. Jonas tightened his grip on the rope beside him, preparing for whatever the sea, the crew, or fate might throw next. The first mutiny attempt. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted one moonless night. Exhaustion, hunger, fear, and resentment had coalesced into a dangerous brew. A group of sailors, emboldened by weeks of hardship and the captain's unpredictable wrath, decided to challenge authority. Whispers turned into plans, and plans turned into action. It began quietly. A few sailors slipped through the shadows of the deck, knives hidden, eyes alert for any sign of betrayal. Jonas had sensed the unrest in the days leading up to this moment. He noticed furtive glances, tense conversations, and subtle acts of defiance. Experience had taught him to read the currents of human behavior as carefully as the wind and waves. As the mutineers moved to seize the captain and gain control of the ship, the deck erupted in chaos. Shouts, curses, and the clash of steel filled the night. Jonas stayed calm, positioning himself to observe both sides, calculating the safest and most effective way to intervene. His heart pounded, but his mind worked with precision. Barrett, the scarred veteran, was the first to engage the ringleaders. He swung his cutlass with deadly accuracy, cutting down one man before the others could react. Merrick, despite his previous jealousy of Jonas, fought with grim determination, protecting the captain from a sudden attack. The chaos was brutal. Men were thrown against rails, stabbed, or swept overboard by the rolling ship.
Jonas acted decisively. Using his knowledge of the deck and crew, he guided loyal men to key positions, creating choke points and defending the captain's vulnerable flank. He disarmed a mutineer who lunged at the captain, using leverage and speed rather than brute force.
His actions were precise, calculated, and life-saving. The fight was over quickly, but left a lasting impression. 2 mutineers lay dead, several more were wounded, and the remaining conspirators were subdued and punished. The captain, though visibly shaken, acknowledged Jonas's role with a rare nod of approval. For the first time, Jonas realized that survival and influence were intertwined. Cunning, courage, and careful observation could elevate a young sailor beyond mere endurance. The aftermath was tense. The crew had witnessed both the consequences of rebellion and Jonas's growing competence. Fear, respect, and grudging admiration circulated among the men. Mutiny had been attempted and crushed, but the underlying resentment remained. Jonas understood that the battle for influence, survival, and control was ongoing, and that every choice from this point forward would carry weight. Over the following days, Jonas continued to solidify his position. He oversaw repairs, helped distribute rations, and mediated disputes. His ability to read the crew, predict their reactions, and act decisively earned him subtle influence. Even those who had previously doubted him began to defer to his judgment in moments of uncertainty. Survival aboard the pirate ship had become a complex interplay of physical skill, psychological insight, and strategic action. The first mutiny attempt had left scars: physical, emotional, and social. The ship was quieter now, but tension lingered like a shadow over the deck. Jonas knew that further challenges were inevitable. Life aboard a pirate ship was a constant negotiation between fear, authority, and cunning. Every day was a test, every night a trial, and survival demanded intelligence, patience, and unflinching awareness. As Jonas stood at the railing that evening, staring at the dark horizon, he reflected on the events of the past weeks. Storms, raids, injuries, illness, and mutiny had all tested him in ways he had never imagined. He tightened his grip on the rope beside him, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The sea did not forgive mistakes, and the crew did not easily forget power or weakness. Survival required more than strength. It demanded cunning, observation, and an unyielding will to endure. Storms of blood, bigger raids, and greater peril. The morning sun rose weakly over a horizon veiled in mist. Jonas stood at the railing, muscles sore and eyes alert, knowing that fragile peace from the failed mutiny would not last. The crew was restless, whispers of discontent lingering beneath polite compliance. Every man carried fear, resentment, or ambition like a hidden weapon, waiting for the right moment to strike. The captain announced a target, a convoy of merchant ships rumored to carry gold, spices, and other treasures. Unlike previous raids, this mission promised wealth but also danger. The convoy was heavily armed, with multiple ships protecting one another and crews trained to repel attackers. Jonas felt the familiar thrill of fear and anticipation coil in his stomach. Survival would demand skill, cunning, and courage. Preparation began immediately. Sailors worked to repair sails, check cannons, and secure weapons. Jonas coordinated with Barrett and Merrick, assigning men to strategic positions on deck. He noted the strongest sailors for boarding parties and placed less skilled men where they could be observed and controlled. Every detail mattered. One miscalculation could mean death. As they approached the convoy, tension escalated. The lookout shouted, "3 ships ahead, moving fast!" Jonah's heart pounded as the captain barked orders. Cannons were loaded, ropes secured, and boarding hooks prepared. The crew moved with mechanical efficiency, their fear and adrenaline blending into a tense harmony.
Boarding the merchant vessels was a brutal affair. Swords clashed, muskets fired, and screams echoed over the waves. Jonas moved through the chaos with calculated efficiency, disarming opponents, helping wounded comrades, and seizing key positions on the ship. The fight was not only against the enemy, it was against the environment, the waves, and the panic threatening to overwhelm the crew. The first boarding party succeeded in taking one merchant ship, but at a high cost. Several pirates were dead or mortally wounded, including a young sailor who had joined only months before. Jonas's hands were bloodied from helping drag the injured to safety and subduing resisting merchants. The smell of blood, salt, and fear was pervasive. Even as they celebrated their partial victory, the remaining merchant ships counterattacked. Cannons rained down, damaging sails and killing men indiscriminately. Jonas ducked beneath the railing to avoid shrapnel, feeling the sting of metal and the weight of exhaustion pressing on him. Survival was no longer a choice. It was an instinct, a constant calculation of risk versus reward. Back on the pirate ship, the crew tended to injuries while preparing for the next assault. The storm of battle had left their numbers diminished, morale frayed, and rations even scarcer. Jonas observed the crew carefully, noting who was reliable, who faltered under pressure, and who might cause trouble if left unchecked. The lessons from the first mutiny had sharpened his instincts. He understood now that leadership required both action and careful observation.
Psychological strain was mounting. Men muttered about curses, the anger of the sea, and the ghosts of those lost in battle. Fear coexisted with greed, creating tension that could erupt at any moment. Jonas participated in the rituals quietly, not out of belief, but as a strategy to maintain control over the fragile psyche of the crew. By nightfall, the pirate ship had survived the day's battle, but was battered and bloodied. Injuries, fatigue, and fear were everywhere. Jonas, exhausted but alert, took stock of his position. He had survived cannon fire, boarding chaos, and human error. He had mediated disputes, saved lives, and made decisions that influenced the outcome of battle. He realized that survival was no longer about endurance alone. It was about strategy, foresight, and psychological insight.
As the stars emerged through the dissipating clouds, Jonas gazed at the horizon. The sea was calm for now, but tomorrow would bring new raids, storms, and tests of survival. Every choice, every action, every observation mattered. The world of pirates was one of constant danger, where the line between life and death was razor thin, and where cunning often determined who endured and who perished. Jonas tightened his grip on the railing, ready for the trials that lay ahead. The horizon promised peril, but also opportunity. Survival demanded vigilance, intelligence, and the ability to navigate both the sea and the men who sailed it. And Jonas, now tested by storms, mutiny, and battle, was learning how to do all three.
And so that is the harsh, brutal reality of life aboard a pirate ship. No treasure, no freedom could ever erase the constant fear, the hunger, the injuries, and the storms that tested every sailor to their limits. Jonas survived where many others fell, not because he was the strongest, but because he learned the rules of survival,
observation, cunning, strategy, and the unyielding will to endure. The sea demanded respect, the crew demanded vigilance, and every day was a fight to live. So the next time you imagine pirates as glamorous adventurers with gold and rum, remember the reality, pain, suffering, and death lurking behind every wave. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another journey into the forgotten, terrifying corners of history. Close your eyes, drift into the night, and let the tales of the sea carry you into calm, reflective sleep. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. That way, you'll never miss another journey into the dark, brutal, and fascinating corners of history.